Testing, 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 testing. Help, can't talk, nobody can hear me. Hello, hello. Hello, hello, there we go. I'm now amplified. Ooh, it sounds so loud right here. Good evening, it is good to see everyone tonight. We're going to be continuing our study, or at least the first half of our study that's going to kind of focus on the context of what we're reading. We've been talking through some very broad things as we've been going through this study. As I promised you last week, I'm going to share a few resources up on the screen. If you're inclined to have some tools around that may help you and something maybe you want to read a little bit at a time of to understand a little bit more about your biblical backgrounds. And what I'm going to give you tonight is primarily the New Testament type stuff. There are similar resources out there for the Old Testament. And so I promised I would share a few of those with you, and I'll put them up on the screen tonight and talk about them a little bit. And you can look them up, take a picture of them, or email me, and I can send you a bibliography of them and looking through that. But tonight, we're going to continue looking at the background essentially of the Greco-Roman world and the Jewish world that Jesus lived in. And so not about Judaism itself, but more about the society. And some of the things tonight may be a little bit stranger, a little bit more odd. The goal is not that you memorize all of this or put it all in your brain. What it is to kind of just give you a clue of what's out there. And as you approach Scripture, knowing these things in general being beneficial to have. You by no means have to be an expert in these things, but you need to be aware of them as we go through it. So last week, if you remember, we talked about some of the things are familiar. We talked about like pervasive government, some of the economic things that we encounter. A lot of things are sin is something that is very familiar to us, but many things are vastly different. And what we're going to talk about tonight, about an honor-shame culture, about a patron-client system, those things are unfamiliar to you who have been born and raised in a Western culture, and especially an American culture. We talked last week a little bit about some of the limited resources, the Greco-Roman slave system, and we talked about how the slave system had some similarities to 18th, 19th century North American slavery and Caribbean slavery, but there were some big differences, and those differences are very important. And we shouldn't apologize for what the Bible has to say when it talks about it, because sometimes those metaphors, for example, about us being slaves to Christ are very important to us theologically, because you are owned by Jesus Christ. And that is important for us to know. We're no longer owned by slave and the devil. And very importantly, something that we don't encounter unless the toilet paper shipments run out, a world of limited resources, and not just physical resources, but in the mindset of the ancients, there's also a limited amount of grace to go around, a limited amount of spiritual gifts to go around, and as we'll talk about tonight, only a certain amount of honor to go around as well. And so if we want something, we typically have to acquire it from someone else. There's a scales and balances system to that, but certainly not a world where there were seemingly endless supplies of water from the faucet or food from the grocery store that they had lived in. So I want to share with you a few books tonight, and I'll tell you just briefly about a few of them as we go through that. And many people have asked me about this. Everett Ferguson's book is an excellent book. Dr. Ferguson has passed. Now he was a restorationist, probably the only restorationist that is an author that is respected at the level that he is respected at. An expert in early Christianity and Christian backgrounds. He's written a lot of volumes, a lot of essays, a lot of articles, a lot of books about early Christianity. When I say that, I usually refer to the time period before Constantine in the early part of the 4th century, before, in my opinion, Christian became a government institution. And so he's a tremendous author. This book is wonderful because it has several short articles that he wrote in it. It's not pages and pages, for example, on each subject, but it's very, very broad. It covers the time between the Testaments, the things that have come up in religion for the Greeks, for the Romans, for the Jews, a lot of things in society that we're talking about tonight. It's an excellent book. It's paperback. It's in its third edition. I wish the fourth one would come out. I don't know that it'll happen since he's passed, but it's an excellent resource. You can get it for like less than $20 on Amazon. And so it's not an expensive one that you'll look at. I haven't given you any resources that, in my opinion, are expensive. Expensive to me is something that costs $100 or more. And many resources cost that much, but I'm not giving you that today. The other one, The World of the New Testament there, that's got a cultural, social, and historical context. What I like about that type of book is, and I recommend this to you as you study, is it's not a book by just one or two authors. It's a collection of essays that has been edited. So there are essays in there about all the different things we've talked about and a whole lot more that we haven't talked about yet. Family life, women, all those things, marriage, all those things that are in there, those institutions. And they're essays by authors who have been selected because of their expertise in that particular topic. And so that's an excellent way to get a lot of scholarship combined in one volume. And so that's something I recommend. A relatively new one is N.T. Wright and Michael Bird's The New Testament in Its World. It's written at really what I would call just the average layperson's level. Really, most of these kind of are. Not to say that's exciting. I'm not saying they're exciting. But here, that book has got a lot of photographs, a lot of pictures, a lot of charts, a lot of timelines, a lot of things in there that people would generally like maybe in a study Bible. Along those sense. And I really, really enjoy Michael Bird's writings. I read a lot of his writings. I don't read a lot of N.T. Wright's because he's more of a theologian, and I didn't study theology. The other one's by Jeffers, is kind of a pretty namesake one of the Greco-Roman world, and it really explores the background primarily, obviously, of the world outside of Palestine. It's a little bit more of just like a book that you would read, and so I highly recommend it. I probably use that book a lot in papers that I wrote for school. A couple of books that are pretty respected when it comes to the Jewish backgrounds is Dr. Scott's book is been around for a pretty good amount of time, but it's particularly focused obviously on the Jewish backgrounds of the New Testament. And then Cohen's book takes you, and when I say from the Maccabees to the Mishnah, it is going to take you back to the time when the Jews rebelled against their Greek overlords in the middle of the 2nd century BCE. From that time, the Maccabees led a revolt that led to the defeat of the Greeks, and they ruled themselves for about 100 years. The Jews ruled over themselves, and so we have that history in the books of 1 and 2 Maccabees in the Apocrypha. The Mishnah is all the way forward almost to Rabbinic Judaism. The word Mishnah is talking about the oral Torah. Many of you have maybe heard about the Pharisees that believed in an oral law that was handed to Moses, but it wasn't written down, and it was handed down by the elders of Israel all the way through generation after generation. That's codified in what's called the Mishnah. It's combined with the Gemara, a commentary on that is the Talmud. That dominates rabbinical Judaism. So this is a really good book if you want to think about the history of the Jews and everything through that time period. And then something I would recommend to you as you study a particular book, there is a series of books. I just put the one on Revelation up here, for example. They're reading blank in context, meaning reading Romans in context, reading Revelation in context, Matthew, Luke, whatever. There are a series of books that have multiple contributors to them. There's about 15 or 20 there that are going to talk about the cultural context of that particular book, the religious, the theological context of those particular book. And then, like, for example, if you want to focus on families, there are resources out there such as this by Osick and Balk that talk about households. Households were different. I have so much in my 30 years of really paying attention to this in church, heard a lot about marriage and family and women's roles and parenting that people have ripped out of the Bible completely out of context. Their households, their marriage, and the idea of parenting is so different than ours. And the idea also of what did it mean for churches to meet in houses. You know, the concept of a building such as what we are in, being owned by a church and a place that they meet, doesn't really occur in the first few centuries of Christianity, maybe the first 2 or 3 centuries of Christianity. They met in houses because that's what they had. And so maybe some of them found a building to meet in, but we don't really have evidence of that, I think, and probably up until like the 3rd century or later on in the 2nd century. But it's very important for us to understand the household, especially parenting. I've heard that abused in the Bible a lot. There are very, very, very few passages about parenting in the entirety of Scripture because, as we're going to talk about in about a week and a half, their parents really weren't that concerned with winning the parenting award for the year. They were lucky to keep 50% of their children alive past the age of 10, much less worry about parenting like people do today. Jesus probably knew his dad's trade and was ready for adult responsibility when he was a 12-year-old and went to the temple. And in reality, most 12 to 16-year-old girls were being talked about getting married. And so parenting was a very, very short period of time. But I really recommend the In Context books. They're really good. They're very short, most of them about a half-inch thick, but they're really good if you say you're going to sit down and study through a particular book. It's good. They don't cost very much either. They're in paperback, make a really good investment. And so obviously I don't endorse everything that is said in here. I don't endorse anything that's said by anybody in a commentary. For some reason, we feel like if it's written by a member of the church, then they're infallible. I don't know why that is. I can find dozens of errors in the commentaries that we have from Gospel Advocate or anybody else. You're not infallible just because you're a member of the Church of Christ. And so I don't endorse everything that these people have to say. I don't endorse, half the time I don't even endorse what I have to say. And so I just give you these things because if you want to do Bible study, this is the type of elbow grease that you're going to have to put in. You're not going to be able to just approach it that way. And so I hope that was helpful. Like I said, if that was too fast or whatever, there's dozens of other. I only tell you about those because I own them and have used them. And they are on my shelf and are frequently used. I wouldn't ever recommend something to you that I had never used. So continuing our look at the Greco-Roman world, I think Melina had a really good comment, and this is where we get into trouble. It's when we read your Bible translation. Notice he doesn't say your Bible. When you read your Bible translation in America at the beginning of the 21st century, of course, we're kind of a quarter of the way in now. It kind of seems a little bit weird, doesn't it? We're still in the beginning, though. You transfer the coherent words of first century non-Americans into your own social setting. And this is I wish I could put up a barrier to this being done because it leads to false teaching and improper biblical interpretation. But it is just very natural for us to do. We cannot imagine their world because we never lived in it. I think there's some cultures that we could go to and live amongst for about 2 or 3 years. And every one of them is east of here. Well, if you want to travel in that direction, you could get to them going west too. But most of them we would call an Eastern culture today. I think we could appreciate a little bit more about the world that they lived in. But we just need to be aware that we do that. All of us do that. I do that. Everybody does it. But we have to remember, especially if we're going to start espousing doctrine to people or correcting somebody else's theology, we ought to be very cautious that we are not interpreting the Bible with 21st century lenses when you, in fact, even just in time, are 2,000 years removed from that. I mean, you just think about, even in European culture, even in Western culture, 2,000 years ago, I mean, the English language didn't even exist. It was hundreds of years away from even existing. And so just keep that in mind as we go through and think about this stuff. So something that's very important, like I said, this is not something I'm telling you got to be just absolutely fluent in, but realize that we are dealing with a culture where honor and shame are real things. Now, we in some ways have these thoughts in our ideas, but we think about shame as embarrassing. You know, I made a fool of myself, which I've done many times. And maybe I'm embarrassed, but I don't suffer necessarily social punishment for that. Or I don't get ostracized from my community for that. And it's important that we understand the culture we live in. So how do we even define that? Well, my honor is a claim to worth that is socially acknowledged and respected, okay? It's all right if I think I am an honorable person, but nobody in this room thinks that. Well, I don't have any honor. I don't have any honor unless the community and others have this great deal of respect and honor for me. And we see this come up a lot in Jesus' life, a lot about where people are sitting at tables, whose house you go into, who you're around. This is important. We generally assign this sort of veneration based on wealth. Okay? And so, and to be sure, many people that had honor were wealthy. But you didn't have to be wealthy to have honor. You could be honorable because you did the things that were your duty to do in society. Whether that was being a mother or being a husband or being a businessman, whatever a politician, whatever your responsibility was, to carry that out properly would be to be honorable. And that would be bestowed and to be respected. Jesus was honored by several people. He even has called by an honorific title of rabbi. You just didn't go throw that name out to everybody in Judea. You know, he did receive some respect. I think he was seated beside Simon in the house when the woman was washing his feet and weeping at him and going in, and Simon started, "What are you doing letting this woman touch your feet? Don't you know who she is?" I think they were carrying that conversation side by side because Jesus was right next to the owner of the house, so Jesus was in the seat of utmost honor to be by him. Jesus gives us a parable. When you go into wedding to a feast or whatever, and you sit in the most honorable position, be careful, because if somebody comes in with greater honor than you, you're going to be ushered to the different part of the table, and you're going to feel shame. You're going to be embarrassed. And so we don't think about that because we generally don't seat ourselves thinking about honor. But in a way that we do, who's at the head of the table? If we're at a dinner that's for somebody, generally they're seated in the center of the table in front of people. We still have a little bit of that concept in our minds, but not so much as they do. Or who could bring shame on a family? I'm a very firm believer because of the Roman world that Paul was writing to, that I think sometimes as Americans, when we think about elders and their children being trustworthy and faithful, I don't believe that word necessarily means baptized. And I sit on an island all by myself in that, because children could bring shame or honor upon their parents when they were 30 years old. It was not just when they lived under their household until the paterfamilias died. You would live under your father's authority until he died. He would always be the head of the family. And I could bring shame upon him, or I could bring honor upon him my whole life. And we'll talk here in a minute. There are cultures today in the world that is the same thing. Adult children are not expected to bring shame upon the family. They're expected to do things that are honorable to the patriarch of the family. And it's very important that somebody that's going to lead the church does not have children who are disobedient to him and bring shame upon him, and that he has a good reputation among outsiders. There's a reason for that. You don't want to have dishonorable people leading your church. It can be ascribed based on birth, for example. We'll talk in a minute. Jesus' genealogy is often thought, and I think correctly, that we see, for example, in Matthew and Luke, is to prove, some people just solely say, it's to prove that he's descended from David. And he's of the tribe of Judah, and he's of the lineage of the Messiah. But it's also a way of ascribing him some honor in the fact that he is the descendant of a king. And not everybody is listed in that genealogy. It does skip over some people. But the people that are listed are very, very important people along the lines. Your gender would often affect your honor, and it also affect your social class and your status. Now, you're born into a class. We'll talk about that tonight as well, and talk about the inability for upward mobility in it. So some honor is ascribed to you just by natural. You're born into it in a way. Sometimes you acquire it, and to acquire a limited resource means somebody else has it, and so it's acquired through competition and challenge. Me taking someone's position, me becoming the honorable person amongst the community. It isn't a world. We can't think about that. We think there's plenty of honor to go around. But as we think about somebody having honor, sometimes they acquire that through competition with somebody who may be more honorable than them or esteemed in that way. And I know this seems silly to us, but it's of terribly high importance to them. And the New Testament is littered with this thought, or at least the undercurrents of that thought. Shame could be brought on you because a lack of respect for the rules. And for everybody, there were certain rules. There were expectations for you to fulfill because of just who you were, what you were born into, what profession you had, what responsibilities you had in the household or in the community. And if you failed to do that, that was shameful. It was shameful. If you failed to be obedient to authority or to your parent, if you failed to be the proper husband or mother or wife or whatever that winds up being, then you could bring shame upon yourself. You were expected to do certain things. We're pretty much thinking we can do whatever we want to do. You know, we can do whatever we want to do. We can take on whatever responsibilities we want to do. We can shirk whatever responsibilities we don't want to do, and we just walk away from those responsibilities, or we change them. Or I don't really care what Steve's expectation of me. Steve's asleep, so I'm going to wake him up. Steve's expectation of me is to be as a husband in my life, because I may have a different definition of what that's going to be. But in this society, there are certain things you have to fulfill. We're going to talk about this in a minute. In a society where individualism doesn't matter, and the needs of the group are the most important, and a society where people live shoulder to shoulder, people not fulfilling their duties affects everybody else around them. Okay, we don't imagine that, because we all live in our little privacy fence houses and apart from each other. But just imagine if everybody lived in an apartment style living. How many of you guys have ever lived in an apartment or a dormitory? People around you affect what goes on in your life, right? Somebody falls asleep with a cigarette in bed, they'll burn your house down. Okay, so think about a way that can affect people around them. And so for comparison today, interesting enough, I think about your social credit rating. How many friends you got on Facebook? In a way, what do people think about you? We generally look at somebody who have like 3,000 friends on Facebook, and man, that really person, a lot of people do like that person. And what is their status amongst those people? And as we'll ask here in just a minute, today's modern Eastern cultures that we have a real hard time understanding. So over in the New Testament, as we think about these things, we see some ascribed things. I mentioned Jesus' genealogy. Sometimes when you think about your family origins, Paul describes himself in very honorable terms. For example, a Hebrew of Hebrews, of the tribe of Benjamin. Have you ever remembered that Paul is named after the first king of Israel? His name is Saul, and I don't know why everybody paints Saul as such a bad person. They act like he's just the most villainous person that ever walked the face of the earth. If that was true, nobody'd be naming their kids after him. Okay, if Israelites viewed him in that way, nobody'd be naming their kids after him. But Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, and so was Paul, and his parents named him after him, and his parents seemed to be pretty well-to-do people. A Hebrew of Hebrews, a Pharisee, educated in the law at the feet of Gamaliel. He went to the proverbial Harvard of Jerusalem and educated in that. Paul was well educated in Greek rhetoric and the Greek language, in speaking, and so he a very honorable person. But now he often also says those things are garbage for the cause of Christ. Those things don't mean anything, but he wouldn't say that unless they meant something to other people. Right? If that wasn't something that I would normally put on my resume to be accepted in that society, then why would Paul mention them? He's making a contrast of what he doesn't want to do. I already mentioned thinking about Jesus' genealogy there. Also, some collective honor. What does Nathaniel say? What good comes out of Nazareth? Well, I don't think Nazareth was a place where people ascribed it much honor in doing it. Very, very small village. It's a much bigger city today. And remember when Paul quotes from the Greek saying, all Cretans are liars. Now, I don't know anybody from Crete today, and I would hate to call them liars in thinking through that, but they weren't viewed very well for some reason. So if you ever go do business in Crete, I would be careful to see if Paul's thing is still true along those lines. But we think about how some people view different groups, and that may be very different depending on your point of view. I was talking with Craig today a little bit. We were talking about something out of 1 John 5, and talking about some of these heresies that he's been mentioning from the pulpit in Sunday morning. Keep in mind, everything we know about heresies is written by their enemies. We don't really necessarily know. It's kind of like what we know about Sadducees is all written by their enemy, Josephus, and the New Testament, which doesn't seem to like Sadducees very much either. So they might have been better people than we think, but we don't really have. I often tell people it's like written, the British version of the American Revolution. It's not going to be friendly. So sometimes even in early Christianity, these heretics, people that were shunned, they were looked at as maybe even dishonorable amongst people. Jesus, Paul talks in Philippians 2 that Jesus, who is worth the utmost honor, and God humiliated himself, shamed himself by coming down here to earth in some earthly form, and then God exalted him because he humbled himself, even willing to go to a cross, and God exalted him. God gave him great honor and great prestige. Now, we don't think about that, but he did. And so that lesson is sometimes you may have to humble yourself to be raised up. That would be a foreign concept. Remember, why does Paul have to teach those things? Well, because that would be a very foreign concept. For me to give up honor and put myself in a position of shame would not make a lot of sense in that society. How much more shameful can you be to be stripped down, beat like an animal, and put up on a Roman cross with common thieves on each side of you? And to be chosen for that over an insurrectionist. So it's very shameful what Jesus went through, very embarrassing, very terrible thing that Jesus went to, the mocking of Christ by the crown of thorns, being humiliated. Wouldn't nobody think that the Messiah is going to go through that? That didn't make any sense to those people. We think about the concept that is challenging for modern day elders in a church to deal with is putting the sinner out. It's a teaching in 1 Corinthians 5. We call it disfellowship. That's a word that we call it by. Paul says you've got this guy sinning amongst you. He's with his stepmother, and he's got to be put out. He's got to be put out of the church. Now, there's two reasons for that. One is to shame him into repentance. And the other thing is a little bit of yeast leavens the whole loaf. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one. Absolutely. Now, we don't practice that today. We'll overturn this whole congregation because 3 people complain about something. Or we won't ever rebuke somebody or disfellowship them because they're going to go on Facebook and tell us about how we don't love sinners. Or they're just going to go down the street to the next church. That wasn't the luxury in Corinth. There was not a church on every street corner, okay? And even I think, and there's a lot that agree with this, that even people outside of Christianity would have seen this man put out of his social group and look at him with shame. I mean, imagine it'd be like, hey, he can't even get along with the crazy Christians. He can't even get along with those cannibalistic atheists over there. And so for him to be shamed, to be put out of his social group would have shamed him into repentance. We don't feel that way because we feel like as individuals we trump the church. But the most important thing to Paul is that church in Corinth not be corrupted by that person. The church is more important than the individual, and that is not how we teach Christianity today. That's not how we look at things today. We'll talk a little bit more in a couple of weeks about household codes, expectations that we see in Ephesians and Colossians and 1 Peter. What are the expectations? Paul didn't make up the household codes that we see about wives being subject to your husband, and husbands doing this, and masters and slaves and children. He merely repeats those things as honorable things to do, but now you're going to do it for a different reason. It's because of Christ. And I'm going to give you some comparisons because of that. I'm Paul's saying it. I'm going to compare some of these things to Christ. Because Christ loved the church. Well, that's a whole different ballgame now. That you may wind up doing these things. And I talked a minute ago about banquet seating. There's a lot of banquet imagery in Jesus' conversations and where you're going to sit. We even think about James and John. Remember what in some of the Gospels they asked Jesus, and others it's their mother asking this, hey, we want to sit at your right and left hand in the kingdom one day. Okay, they had no idea what they were asking for, right? No idea. I have an idea of what they thought they were asking for. And so we want to be at the positions of great honor in your kingdom. And Jesus, as he's always prone to do, you sure about that? Are you sure? I'm going to give you a chance to get out of that request. You want to be baptized with the same baptism as me? And what do they say? Sure. Now, if I could show them a video of Jesus hanging on the cross, and then they come back to that decision, they may be like, maybe not. Maybe that right and left hand ain't such a great place to be sitting after all, and going through that. I know what people are going to say. They're going to be like, well, they all died a martyr's death. We don't know that from anything other than legend. So we think about what they ask for, positions of honor and seating in a position. We talk about Jesus being an honorable position, right? Seated at what? The right hand of the throne of God. Is there any higher position than the throne? No, there's not. So there's a concept of that we don't know because we don't have anybody that sits on a throne. We've had some presidents that think they sit on a throne, but for the most part, they don't sit on a throne. And we don't know what that is like in that way. My favorite Star Trek movie, for you nerds in here, is Star Trek II, which is inarguably the best Star Trek movie that's ever made. I said a phrase a minute ago, I wanted to quote Captain Spock and his great wisdom, because he says, logic dictates that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. And that's absolutely correct. He sacrifices himself. Now, he comes back to life in later movies, so it's not too bad, but he sacrifices his own life for everybody on the ship. And we've all heard stories of the guy who throws himself on a grenade, the guy that runs out and draws the fire while the rest of the team escapes, whatever that may wind up being. I will tell you the biggest difference between their society and our society is collectivism versus individualism. The needs of the community always trump the needs of the individual. And we see that teaching reinforced. That's not an invention of Christianity. That was how their world functioned. That was how their world functioned. And we don't function that way. I want me to benefit, even if it's at James's expense. Okay? I want my roads paved, and I want my meat inspected, and I want my criminals arrested, but I don't want to pay for it. I don't want to do that. Or I don't want to give up something so somebody else can have something. And isn't it beautiful that in the church, people are willing to do that? Whether it's our time, or it's our money, or whatever. But for many people in Christianity, unfortunately, the world revolves around them. I don't like the singing. I don't care if you don't like singing. All I care is if God likes the singing, if it teaches and admonishes one another. That's the only requirements. It's not a requirement for you to enjoy it. Teaching is only supposed to do three things: give thanks to God, to teach you, and to admonish you. That's the only three New Testament purposes for singing. You know, what are we willing to give up for other people? Even in our community, Jesus gave up everything for the group, for the collective, for the church. We preach that, but do we really believe because we're going to be like Christ and disciples and followers of Christ, are we always willing to put the group ahead of ourselves? And in the church, that's this group. That's this congregation of the Lord's church, where everybody in the group is more important. So my gossip and my slander and my envy and my own personal selfishness or my greed, all of those things don't really matter. And I'll tell you, the strongest Christians that I respect the most in this congregation, and the ones that are the reason I was baptized at this congregation, are those type of people. And I know a few of them. And I know that they would give everything. They'd burn their house to the ground for the Lord's church. And that's the kind of people that I see and say, okay, out of the 1,000, that's the few that I really respect the most in what they are willing to do. And so we think about this kind of just out loud. What are some cultures today that you think of that would practice this honor-shame system like we've talked about? Okay. India is a very, very prime example. When you think about the head of the family and the children, you don't just marry whoever you want to in an honor-shame culture. Richard's going to pick out whose kid's going to marry. And that's a shudder to think about that, right? And so you're going to decide, because we're not going to bring a family in that's dishonorable into our family. It doesn't matter if you love them and all that. I don't think Mary and Joseph went on dates to the drive-in and held hands and looked into each other's eyes. I really feel like Mary's parents and Joseph's parents put that together. And it would be very normal to expect that. But we think a lot about that more romantically in those eyes. But that's very true. Indian culture, in some ways, sometimes we think about honor shame, we may run to like feudal Japan of the Middle Ages. Or of like the 15th, 16th century, a warrior culture. I don't necessarily want to paint that picture like in that kind of sense, but in some Eastern cultures that way. What else do you think? Native American culture, that's right. How much respect is there given for the elders and the community and the betterment of the group? Because everybody's got to work together. Somebody's got to kill the buffalo, somebody's got to skin the buffalo, somebody's got to dry the skin out, somebody's got to make the meat happen, and then somebody's got to do this, somebody's got to build the canoe, somebody's got to do everything that everybody relies on to do the hunt. So I never really have thought about that, but in some ways you can think about what is shameful and what is honorable. A lot of Arabic cultures, okay, you guys can't comprehend that you might kill your children for bringing shame upon the family. That's a real thing in cultures that are thousands of years older than yours. and have been around for a whole lot longer than we're just a little blip in human history, the American culture is. Yes, because that's how important shaming the family is. Now, we don't think that's fair. We don't think that's right. It doesn't fit our ideology, but it's true. And so we think about some of those cultures, and also the sense of community that's had when people are living right on top of each other all the time, and the sense of what is honorable and apparent and disappointing in that way, and choosing who you're going to marry. We think about all those things as being very backwards, but that's very foolish for us to think, because their culture has outlasted yours and probably will outlast yours. And so we think about an honor-shame culture has been around a whole lot longer than those things. So it's very challenging. We don't really run into this in European cultures very often. And so as you think about how strange, the reason I say that is not to endorse what they're doing, but to tell you, as strange as those seem to you, that's how strange this world should seem to you. Does that make sense? As far away from us as we think that is, that's how you need to think about the world of the New Testament. A little bit about patron-client. This is not too big of a deal. This is something that I tell people, if you want to understand how this works, you go watch The Godfather. This will tell you how this works. A professor told me that one time, and it's stuck ever since. Most patrons were people who had means, a source of financial support, legal aid, contributed to the community. For example, holding banquets for people to come to, building meeting places like the centurion that built a synagogue for the Jews. You build temples, you build theaters, you do things, and that brings honor upon you, but it also makes the people in the community owe you. Remember, this is not a world where you had an organized police force or a banking system for loans like you might be familiar with. They couldn't get on Spotify, well, not Spotify, what was it? SoFi. They couldn't get on SoFi and get a loan online. I got to go borrow money from somebody, and they couldn't look up my credit rating online. What kind of credit rating do I have? I don't know, but I'm going to let you borrow money from me, and you're going to owe me for that. I'm going to do this for you, and you're going to owe me. One day I may call on you to do a service for me, and thinking about what that is restored. It's not evil. It's just the way things functioned in that society. So for a client, that would be the people who needed something from them. And they would benefit from these places that they built, from legal aid, from helping them get out of jail, maybe helping them get out of debt. Well, I'm going to owe you one. I'm going to owe you something. And the more people that were your clients, the more honor and prestige that you had. And that seems weird to us, but in some ways we think about that in the same way. How many followers have you got? You know, and that bringing more prestige to you and looked in that way. And also giving you political support. Maybe even attending your funerals and your weddings. The wedding in Cana is a good example. It's very interesting that all these people are invited to this wedding, and Jesus and his family are brought there as well. We don't know anything about the family that he went to, but it seems to be a pretty big shindig. And so I'm going to come. Even when I die, Marty's going to come to my funeral because Marty was one of my clients, and the more people are at my funeral, the more honor that I have and the more prestige that I have along those lines. And so even in religious beliefs, you have patron deities of cities. Artemis of the Ephesians is an excellent example of that. And that's how the conversation goes. If you remember in the book of Acts, our great city, Ephesus, which is Artemis looks over and takes care of. We can't make her upset. And look, it's very important. It's very much a sign that one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world existed in that city, the Temple of Artemis, that was 4 times the size of the Parthenon in Greece or the Parthenon in Centennial Park. Imagine how that would be 4 times that size, built with nothing but your hands and tools. And iron tools along those ways. Some of the things we see, I mentioned the big wedding. It's interesting. Jesus and his disciples get invited to this wedding. It seems to be a huge event. Obviously, people drinking a lot of wine at this event because they run out of the wine. And so perhaps this is someone who is a patron in Cana and has a lot of different people that come to a wedding and invites people from all over that way. Maybe he was a benefactor of many different people. I talked already about the centurion that Jesus encounters in the Luke's narrative. This doesn't mention over in Matthew's narrative of the event. But in Luke, the Jews say, this guy has built a synagogue for us. Well, that means he was a man of some means to be able to do that. But also think about, they would hold this guy in high respect and high honor. And doing it. Cornelius, I think, is in that way a lot of ways too. He gives a lot of alms to the poor. He's somebody that's a benefactor, and somebody's centurion would be a person of means. Remember, both these centurions have slaves. Okay, people don't have slaves that don't have any money. I mean, because you still got to feed and support. There's a reason to have slaves, take care of your property, and do whatever. And so perhaps these guys were patrons in the community. I already mentioned Artemis of the Ephesians, a patron deity. We're going to do things for Artemis because Artemis is going to do things for us. We would say those are her worshipers, and they would say in some ways we're her clients and what we owe her for that way. Some things we think about, was the early church dependent upon wealthy patrons? Because you couldn't just go meet in just anybody's house, okay? You had to go meet in somebody's house that had room for maybe perhaps dozens and dozens of people to meet in. We see Stephanus is someone who allows Christians to meet his house. So does Lydia. Phoebe is called, some translations say deaconess. I don't know why. She's just a minister of the church and someone who is probably a benefactor of them. Some scholars think these people acted as patrons for the church, not looking for self-glory, but just doing something on behalf of others that were dependent upon them for certain things. When it comes down to our last thing today, I've spent a lot of time on this, but one of the things is social class. And I think about often here the glass ceiling in the workplace. Sometimes that has referred to historically to women not being able to advance in the workplace, minorities not being able to advance in the workplace. But you can see it, and sometimes you can break through it. Here's what the ceiling looks like in their society. It's made of concrete. You're not moving up. You're not going to move along. You're not going to pick yourself up by your own bootstraps and say, I was born a poor peasant, but I am going to be a senator in Rome one day. No, you're not. It's not going to happen. You're not going to go to that. Now, there are some avenues where you could increase yourself. Slavery and military service. Okay, those are ways that you might be able to move up in life, but you're not going to go from a centurion to emperor in most cases. You may have just bumped the top of the blue-collar world when you get to the level of a centurion, which can be a pretty prominent one, especially if you're a centurion in a legion in Rome. Very, very wealthy, very, very highly paid. And that's what I would say. If you want to join in the military, and you can live long enough to make the rank of centurion and be over 80 people, they weren't over 100, they were over 80, and that's really going to be about it. You're probably not going to command a legion, because that's usually going to be somebody that is born into a higher, wealthier class. Ain't that much different from the United States' war for independence, right? Who were the generals? Poor people? People that clawed their way up the military ladder? No, wealthy landowners. That's how that would work. Educated, because they're one of the few people that could probably read amongst their military personnel. But there's a ceiling in that as well. You're not going to go from foot soldier up to a commander in that way. Just to kind of give you some scale, there's no middle class in this world. What you're born into and where you're at, I would probably put Jesus at the 22%. Because he seemed to be of a family of woodworkers, and maybe, I don't know what exactly they built and what he did, but we see a very, very, very minute percentage of people are going to be Roman elites, senators, local rulers, magistrates, imperials. You go down to a regional level, the equestrian level, upper level military officers that you might see. We're talking about less than 2%. And then when we get down to municipal, a city level, maybe like a Pontius Pilate or somebody underneath that. Some wealthy, some merchants that may own a great deal of business. But the bulk of the people are at subsistence level and below. And when I say subsistence level, it means I've got enough to eat every day. Maybe not a surplus. Remember Jesus' parable about the people in the workplace, in the marketplace? I want to work for a denarius today, and I'm going to stand around until I find somebody that hires me. Because if I don't get a denarius today, I'm not going to feed my family for a day. And so I'm a day laborer, which means I probably live at or below subsistence level. I mean, I'm just barely able to do it. They don't have pantries full of food. They don't have bank accounts. They don't have retirement funds. They don't have all these things in their world. But if you add that up, you can see that about 70% of the people were at maintaining or below subsistence level. Now, these numbers are going to be different every author that you read. I thought it was entertaining. That's why I put the source up here. This guy's pretty precise. I would have just said 20, 40, 30 of the last three, because I don't really know that we know enough information. We don't know as much about the ancient world as we think we do. We actually know very little about the ancient world that we think we do. But the general gist is that about 70 to 80% of people lived at a much different level than we are anticipating. In our society, those different levels still exist, but there's one in the middle that we call the middle class. Now, there's upper middle class, middle class, upper middle class, all kinds of middle classes. But in general, the middle class is not at subsistence level. Okay, their salaries are above the federal poverty level. There's enough money where they can save some of it. They can buy things that maybe they don't necessarily need. There's not a fear that tomorrow we're going to starve to death. Or if I lost my job today, we would immediately be without food the next day. There's a middle class that we don't necessarily see here on this scale. Now, slaves are not on here, but I would put them down in the 28%. I mean, they're going to rely completely on their master. So it's important for us to realize, especially when people have all these conversations about debt and use the New Testament to talk about debt, you went into debt to feed yourself. You didn't go into debt to buy a fancy chariot beyond your means. You didn't run credit cards up. There's just no comparison between those two things in modern day thinking. So appreciate everybody's attention tonight. I know this is kind of boring. We got about a couple more lessons in this, and we're going to get into looking at Paul's journey. So we'll have a little bit more of some concentration. And you'll have homework to read. I know you're not looking forward to that, but we'll do that. Everybody have a wonderful evening, and we will see you guys Sunday.